I was singing along with Brooke, and I found out my voice is not what it normally is. So we'll see how today goes. Solomon was a prolific writer. He was. If he lived today, he'd be on the New York Times bestseller list over and over and over again. People would be lining up at bookstores waiting until his book got released. And if he had a book signing, there'd be a line all the way down to Norfolk and back just to get his book signed. His songs, because he wrote tons of songs too, his songs would be on the top charts week after week after week, just because he wrote so many. And statistically, you're going to be on the top charts because of how much you write. It's just how it happens. We read about him in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 32 to 34. That Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. It's a lot. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. I'll get through this mint. I have it coat my throat. Because he wrote so many proverbs, I can understand in all his talking about wisdom, when he comes to the book of Ecclesiastes, his whole mindset is, are we looking towards God for satisfaction or the earth for satisfaction? He comes to this middle part of Ecclesiastes, and he kind of takes a little turn and talks about wisdom, because he talked about prosperity, and he talked about relationships. He talked about all these things we turn to, and now in this middle part, he talks about wisdom. And in order to pick up and talk about wisdom, he brings in the form of a proverb in order to make his point. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 15 to chapter 10, verse 3, this is this middle part, and he picks up the form of proverbs in this middle part. And proverbs are 2 or 3 verses chunked together, so to speak, thrown together in a seemingly disjointed trail of thought bubbles. And if you pick up the book of Proverbs, that's what you see. 1 verse, 2 verse, 3 verses, sometimes 7 verses, clumped together, but then they seem to have really no bearing to everything that's going on around them. It's this one thought bubble there. And you go to a different thought bubble and a different thought bubble. And so in this passage of Ecclesiastes 7:15 to 10:3, it's all these different thought bubbles that seem to be just floating and not really connected to each other. And lots of people, when they come to this portion of Scripture, they look at it and say, you know what? It doesn't fit with the rest of Ecclesiastes. Because Solomon has a teaching style at the beginning of Ecclesiastes that is this, and then at the end of Ecclesiastes, he's got that same teaching style, but in the middle portion right here, it's completely different. So some people come here and they say, oh yeah, Solomon didn't write this. But it's not the case, because he did write it, because it's the exact same type of writing style you see in Solomon's writing in Proverbs. So if he wrote those parts, he definitely wrote this part. And the whole theme of Ecclesiastes from beginning to end is kept going even through this disjointed section of wisdom literature. It's continuing that theme along. And even though we look at this part of Proverbs and we see these disjointed thought bubbles, they're not really disjointed because there is a theme throughout it. He's making a point. Throughout this disjointed sense of thought bubbles, it's about wisdom versus folly. At the beginning of this section is 7:19. It starts at 13, but this is towards the beginning. It's the introduction to it. It says, "Wisdom makes one wise more powerful than the 10 rulers in a city." Wisdom makes one wise person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. The end of the section, towards the end of the section, Ecclesiastes 9:18, he says, "Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good." All throughout this huge section, he's talking, it says, wisdom provides satisfaction through the fear of God, is what he keeps coming back to over and over and over again, versus folly, which corrupts one's existence. That's the theme of the entire section. We can't say it's just disjointed thought bubbles because they all add to the argument, even though when you look at them and say, I don't see how it connects, there's a thread weaving all throughout it that's sandwiched by the beginning and the end of these two parallel verses. This section is basically 3 chapters, Ecclesiastes 7:13 to Ecclesiastes 10:3. But we're not going to study the whole thing this week because that's just too long of a chunk and I can't do it. So we're going to split it into 2 weeks. This week we're going to discuss 7:15 to 8:17, and we'll dive into the other chunk later on. 7:15 to 8:17 of Ecclesiastes. We read, "In this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these, the righteous perishing in their righteousness, and the wicked living along in their wickedness. Do not be over-righteous, neither be over-wise. Why destroy yourself? Do not be over-wicked, and do not be a fool. Why die before your time? It is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. Wisdom makes one wise person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. Indeed, there is no one on earth who is righteous, no one who does what is right and never sins. Do not pay attention to every word people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you. For you know in your heart that many times you yourself have cursed others. All this I tested by wisdom, and I said, I am determined to be wise. But this was beyond me. Whatever exists is far off and most profound. Who can discover it? So I turned my mind to understand, to investigate, to search out wisdom in the scheme of all things, to understand the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly. I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare. Look, says the teacher, this is what I have discovered. Adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things. While I was still searching but not finding, I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all. This only have I found. God created mankind upright, but they've gone in search of many schemes. Who is like the wise? Who knows the explanation of things? A person's wisdom brightens their face and changes its hard appearance. Obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Do not stand up for a bad cause, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since a king's word is supreme, who can say to him, what are you doing? Whoever obeys this command will come to no harm, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a person may be weighed down by misery. Since no one knows the future, who can tell someone else what is to come? As no one has power over the wind to contain it, so no one has power over the time of their death. As no one is discharged in time of war, so wickedness will not release those who practice it. All this I saw as I applied my mind to everything done under the sun. There's a time when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. Then too I saw the wicked buried, those who used to come and go from the holy place and receive praise in the city where they did this. This too is meaningless. When the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. Although a wicked person who commits 100 crimes may live a long time, I know that it will go better with those who fear God, who are reverent before him. Yet because the wicked do not fear God, it will not go well with them, and their days will not lengthen like a shadow. There's something else meaningless that occurs on earth. The righteous who get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked who get what the righteous deserve. This too, I say, is meaningless. So I commend the enjoyment of life, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all the days of the life God has given them under the sun. When I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the labor that is done on earth, people getting no sleep day and night, then I saw all that God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all their efforts to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim they know it, they cannot really comprehend it. It's a long passage. It's a long passage. He explores the wisdom of wisdom in this passage. And as he explores the wisdom of wisdom, he contrasts the seen world with the satisfying word. Before you dive in, will you pray with me? Father, King of kings and Lord of lords, the one we have privileged to spend time with today and take a break from the chaos of this world and all the things that are tearing at our attention. It's nice to come here with your people and push it all out and just focus on you, our God, the one we need. And we need nothing else because you are our everything, our all in all. Remind us of that fact, God, because so easily we turn and think that we need this and we need that, when all we need is you. And Lord, if we haven't learned that lesson, teach it to us quickly, that we might not lose time in basking in your presence. Father, teach us to lift our eyes off of all that's going on to you. And as I'm up here, Lord, I ask that I would decrease and that you would increase. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, my rock and my redeemer. Thanks, Father. Amen. In this passage, Solomon explains what he has seen in the world. He's the wisest person who's ever lived. He lived a pretty good long life, and so he's seen a lot in his time. Seeing the world under the sun as a human is what he's describing. Not as God, but as a human, because he is human. And he sees a juxtaposition between competing ideas. He's seeing a comparison, so to speak, between two warring factions, if you will, in the world. First, he sees righteousness versus unrighteousness. Ecclesiastes 7, verses 15 to 17, he writes, he says, "In this meaningless life of mine, I've seen both of these, the righteous perishing in their righteousness and the wicked living along in their wickedness. Do not be over-righteous, neither be over-wise. Why destroy yourselves? Do not be over-wicked. Do not be a fool. Why die before your time?" In this, as he's seeing this play out before him, this two warring factions battling it out, his focus is not on the actual fact of whether someone is living a perfect life or someone is living a wicked life. His focus is on their perspective in it. Is their hope in righteousness? That's their perspective. We would call that person the self-righteous one who says, look at me. Look at me. My life is going great because of how perfect I'm living. I have created my own destiny because of my righteousness, is this person. Or on the flip side, their hope is how much fun they're having in life, the wicked person. They're saying, look at me. It doesn't matter what my end is because I'm fulfilling all and every one of my dreams right now. Don't you wish you were me? Don't you wish? Solomon says both groups, those who are putting their hope in wickedness or the people who are putting their hope in righteousness, will come to a miserable end. The self-righteous will perish in their righteousness. It will not do anything to change their destination. It will not save them from any misery in this life. It won't. The wicked will die before their time because of everything they're doing to their bodies. It'll just catch up with them. The battle between the righteous and the unrighteous has no solution, Solomon says, because both extremes are wrong. Both are focusing on the wrong thing. Lots of people, when they come to this passage, they enjoy taking it a little bit out of the context of everything else that's going on in Ecclesiastes and what's going on in the immediate context. And they say, look, Solomon's saying that we need to have a nice balance of goodness and wickedness. Do a little good, do a little wicked, and we're fine. If you haven't had a conversation with someone like that, someday you will. But he's saying, no, we're not supposed to be focusing on ourselves at all. We're not supposed to be focusing on how righteous we are. We're not supposed to be focusing on how wicked we are. But in fact, in Ecclesiastes 7:18, he says, it is good to grasp the one, not let go of the other. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. Our focus isn't, what am I doing? My focus is on God, following him, not the rules and the lists and the desires, but him. He says the fear of God is what we're supposed to. Incidentally, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, which is where Solomon turns next. Not only does he see righteousness versus unrighteousness, but in this passage he's seeing wisdom versus folly. Solomon looks at wisdom and he sees worth in wisdom. In Ecclesiastes 7:19, he says, wisdom makes one wise person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. There's good There's worth in wisdom. But unfortunately, even though wisdom is so valuable, even Solomon, the wisest man in the world, none of us even come a centimeter up to his stature of wisdom. Even he says, I can't be completely wise. I can't know it all. He says, Ecclesiastes 7:23, he says, all this I tested by wisdom, and I said, I am determined to be wise. But this was beyond me. If Solomon says, I cannot be wise enough, who are we to say we can accomplish anything through our wisdom? Because we're not there. Why is it the case that Solomon said that he could not be wise enough? It's because wisdom is found through the fear of God, and no one truly left to themselves seeks after God. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 7:20, he says, indeed, there is no one righteous on earth, no one who does what is right and never sins. Not even Solomon or anyone else. And if wisdom comes from fearing God, and no one fears God, really, no one's wise. Solomon said, instead of wisdom and all these people who claim to be wise, there's folly. Folly, 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 folly all over the place. He looks specifically at the relationships around him. And he says, I see the folly, I see the sinfulness, the unrighteousness in the relationships. We're not truly friends. Even with people we think we're friends with, we're not, because we aren't friendly. He says in Ecclesiastes 7:21-22, he says, don't pay attention to every word people say. You may hear your servant cursing you. For you know in your heart that many times you yourself have cursed others. In our relationships, we show our sin because we're not willing to love unconditionally. He looks at marriages around him and seeing how at odds husbands and wives are, the folly, the sin, the unrighteousness. Verse 26, he says, I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God, but he just said there is no man who pleases God. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare. Our marriages, we're at odds, fighting each other. He's talking about, now I need to take a little step and talk a little bit about the following verses, because people tend to joke about these verses and do all sorts of mental gymnastics with them. In Ecclesiastes 7:27-29, Solomon says, look, says the teacher, this is what I've discovered, adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things. While I was still searching but not finding, I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all. And I've sat in so many men's Bible studies, and they giggle whenever they get to that, and they say, hey, look, see? There's no righteous woman in the world. Don't we all know it? So it's not what this verse is saying. He's not saying that men are more righteous than women. That's not what it is. Incidentally, Solomon had 1,000 wives and concubines. That number 1,000 is very important there. And every single one of the wives and concubines that he brought into his harem was a snare to him. They all turned his heart away from following the one true God and worshiping all these other idols. He's saying that if a man marries the woman who is a snare, who's constantly at odds with him, he says, in my situation, I looked through all the 1,000 wives I've had, and I didn't find one righteous one at all because they were all dragging me away. Every single one of them. And he says, I might find one godly guy who will stand up to me and tell me that I'm messed up and I need to repent and change. Maybe I'll find one, but none of these 1,000 wives are doing that for me. When a man marries a woman who is a snare, he will not find a woman who can be that close friend, who can be that godly influence, because she is constantly trying to be at odds with him, to correct him, to not respect him, but to tear him down. And she will not be that person who will be the righteous. He might find a good godly friend, maybe, hopefully, but not a woman. But the flips can also be true. Women throughout the centuries have been married to men who are sinful and who have torn them down and abused them, and this man has not been the righteous person. And that woman will not find a good, true friend in a man. Might find one in a woman, but because of what this man has done, she won't find a good, true guy. Solomon tried to find wisdom in his life, But all he found around him was folly. Folly, folly, because of unrighteousness, because of sin. It's too bad because wisdom's pretty great. It is. He sees righteousness versus unrighteousness. He sees wisdom versus folly. He sees obedience versus disobedience. Wisdom teaches us how do we be obedient in the face of the worst rulers. Ecclesiastes 8, verses 4-6, Solomon says, "Since a king's word is supreme, who can say to him, 'What are you doing?' Whoever obeys his command will come to no harm, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a person may be weighed down by misery." It's a useful skill to have, to know what is the proper time and procedure. Wisdom teaches us that. Wisdom teaches us how do we be obedient in different circumstances, but even obedience that comes from this wisdom doesn't provide the end we want. Even though we say, hey, that's great, obedience is good, brings good things to us, but really, technically, no, it doesn't. Ecclesiastes 8:14, Solomon says, "There is something else meaningless that occurs on earth, the righteous who get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked who get what the righteous deserve. This too, I say, is meaningless," because rulers are human. They will reward evil and punish good. Humans act sinfully even when it doesn't make sense, and rulers are not above that. All throughout this, Solomon is saying, what use is wisdom then? What use is obedience? If it doesn't get us what we want, if wisdom and obedience do not save us from the fate of the wicked, why should we trouble ourselves with wisdom, with obedience? Why should we trouble ourselves with righteousness? Because it doesn't get us the end that we want. But Solomon is looking at the world from a human perspective, trying to make sense of these warring factions of righteousness versus unrighteousness, wisdom versus folly, obedience versus disobedience. But whenever we look at the world from a human perspective, we never get the answers that we want to get. Doesn't work. So instead of looking around here for the answers, Solomon urges us to have a different focus, to find our joy, our satisfaction, not in the circumstances, not in getting what we want, but in the God who loves us. The word that he gives us that is so incredibly satisfying. Solomon says that if we have found wisdom, we will not be seeking self-righteousness to escape our situation. If we have found wisdom, we will not be seeking wisdom in order to change our life. If we have found wisdom, we will not be seeking obedience in order to gain people's favor. Those are all the wrong perspectives. But if we have found wisdom, we will see God. Truly, if we have found wisdom, we'll see God. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verses 16-17, he says, "When I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the labor that is done on earth, people getting no sleep day or night, then I saw all that God had done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all their effort to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim they know it, they cannot really comprehend it." Wisdom lifts us up from the chaos of this world. So all of a sudden, we're not trying to change our perspective. We're not trying to change how people view us. We're not trying to change all these things. If we're truly seeking wisdom, it lifts us up from the chaos of this world, from all these competing viewpoints, and forces us to stare at the one whose viewpoint is the only one that matters, the creator of the universe. David writes in Psalm 37, verse 7, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes." David's saying the same thing. Don't fret when you see all this stuff happening around you in the world. This isn't what matters. God is the one that matters. He is our focus. He is our viewpoint. He is our hope. And what a beautiful sight it is when we see God for who he truly is. Jonathan Edwards wrote that Jesus is the most beautiful being in the whole world. And it's true. When we really get to know him and we commune with him and we spend time with him, we find out that he is so beautiful. The psalmist says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." And he is. It's so true. when the world comes knocking at my door and I'm just itching to open it up and let it in and say, oh, and the world's saying, look, all these desires I can fulfill for you, all these things that you think will provide satisfaction, it's here at your fingertips. Just open the door. We can remember that no, Jesus is the most beautiful thing. He is everything I need. We have an amazing God, such an amazing God, who allows us to know him. He gave us his word so that we can understand him. He doesn't have to be this thing floating up there and there's no way and we hope maybe possibly, but we get to know him. We get to commune with him. And we get to understand him as best as we, as sinful human being, can. And we don't have to sacrifice to come and commune with him. We don't have to jump through hoops. All we have to do is pick up his love letter to us and read it. Open up our mouth and pray and call out to him. It's an amazing thing. To see God. It's such an amazing thing. And once we see God, we get to be in awe of him. Because we start realizing that we don't really know him. We know a little picture, but we don't know him. Ecclesiastes 8:17, Solomon says, I saw all that God had done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all their efforts to search it out, no one could discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim to know it, they cannot really comprehend it. Much as we try to take God and we put him in the box, we try to systematize who he is and what he does. We can't do it because he is the creator. And the created cannot understand the creator. He is infinite, and the finite cannot understand the infinite. It is impossible for us to truly understand him. Blaise Pascal says this: if there were no obscurity, man would not feel his corruption. If there were no light, man could not hope for a cure. Thus it is not only right but useful for us that God should be partly concealed and partly revealed, since it is equally dangerous for a man to know God without knowing his wretchedness, as to know his wretchedness without knowing God. Pascal always writes a mouthful, but basically he's saying God allows us to know just enough about him so that we might have a relationship with him and obtain salvation, but not enough so that we could become proud and declare that we completely understand that which we cannot. This awe of God, of saying, wow, God, you are amazing, and you're too big for me, brings fear. Ecclesiastes 8:12-13, Solomon writes, he says, although a wicked person who commits 100 crimes may live a long time, I know that it will go better with those who fear God, who are reverent before him. Yet because the wicked do not fear God, it will not go well with them, and their days will not lengthen like a shadow. A healthy fear of saying, wow, God, I don't truly understand you, but I want to. I'm going to spend all eternity knowing about you. That makes us watch our lives. Not that things will go better here on earth, because we don't try to live righteously in order to change our situation and try to switch karma in our favor, so to speak. But we say, God, you're amazing, and you love me so much, even though I can't understand it. And because of your love for me, I want to respond in love for you. I want my life to show how much I love you. Seeing God and having an awe of him produces that in us. And when we see him and we're in awe of him, we get to truly enjoy the gifts that he gives. We get to wallow in them. Ecclesiastes 8:15, Solomon says, so I commend the enjoyment of life, because there's nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all the days of the life God has given them under the sun. We can't let the war between the self-righteous and the indulgent change us. When we see God, we're in awe of him, we get to wallow in his gifts. So we let the war between the self-righteous and the self-indulgent, the wicked, stay over there, because we're wallowing in God's gifts. We can let those who are dismayed over the toil of this world and their households be over there because we're wallowing in God's gifts. We can let all the political talk around the election, even though I really enjoy talking about that sort of stuff. We can allow all the political talk about over the corruption and the lobbying for truth be over there because really it doesn't matter because we are wallowing in God's gifts, the blessing of Him. And we don't have to let anything distract us from the truth that God loves us. He showers His blessing on us, and a relationship with Him is not worth trading for all the jewels and relationships and power in the world. He is everything, and everything else is nothing. Doesn't matter what happens in 2 weeks, because my God is still my God. There's something to be said for the wisdom-led life of peace, to say, I am content to wallow in the blessings of God that He's given me. 1 Thessalonians 4:11, Paul says, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you. Lead a quiet life, the peace, because God has given us peace. So we live that peace, and we don't let everything else change that peace, no matter what it is. A life that comes through the fear of God, not the corruption of folly. Where's your joy in? Is your joy in circumstances? How working cattle went? Where's your joy in? Is your joy in who is running the government? Where's your joy in? Is your joy in how much your bank account is? Where's your joy in? Solomon says all those sorts of things, worth nothing. But God, the God who loves us, provides satisfaction. And I'm grateful for that. Will you pray with me? Father, thank you for being the God who provides satisfaction, true satisfaction. Thank you that the aching in my heart that used to be there is gone because of Jesus Christ. Thank you that there's nothing I had to do to earn that, but you freely gave it by sending your Son to die on the cross for the sins, that whoever believes in you will not perish but have everlasting life. Thank you that we don't have to pursue all these things to try to change our situation, because you are the God who carries us through and over into eternity. And that'll be a glorious day. But teach us, Lord, to find our satisfaction and our joy in you today, because we get to have a relationship with you. And Father, as we live that out, may people see that in us, to know that they too can have this amazing gift of joy and peace and hope in a tumultuous time through a relationship with the eternal God, Creator and King. Thanks, Father. Amen.
If you'd like to stand with me as we sing, we'll close with a song this morning.